I thought I was going to stand in the dark for a minute. It's cool. It's like, I'm actually okay with that. I feel sleepy. We'll just all take a nap together for 30 minutes. Y'all don't have to listen to my voice. Totally cool. Hey, good morning again. I am really, really glad to be with you. We're going to share part 4 in our message series, Walk This Way. We've been talking about this idea that Jesus has called us to follow him. If you grew up in the church like I did, or maybe you're new to the church world, but you've heard some things, what you've probably heard about us is that, in a lot of ways, there's things we do, right? That church people and Christians, people who call ourselves Christians, there's a way we act and the way we live and the way we do. And what we've been trying to do is kind of go back and say, what does that actually look like, right? Jesus invited us to follow him. So what does following Jesus actually look like? And so if today is your first day with us, awesome. I'm so glad that you're here, but you've missed some stuff. So good news, we created this website for you, tcat.church/walkthisway. All the messages that I've had, parts 1 through 3, and then 4 will be up later today. They're all there, along with some discussion questions to help you make sure you kind of get the centerpiece of this. And what I've been challenging us to do, and I would love for you to take this up and start today, is not to just listen to my voice, because, I like my voice, and hopefully you like my voice, but there's more to it than that, right? I want you to wrestle with this. I want you to think about this content. And so here at this website, there's some discussion questions. Sit down with your significant other, your spouse, a friend, your small group, and think about this, right? Not just because I want you to watch the video again, but because there's some really deep stuff we've been talking about. And I think if we can get this right, here's why I'm doing this. This is the dream, okay? If we can get this right, if we as the church and this generation can get this right, then I think revival will break out, and I think that people will come to know the gospel in ways they never have before. I think the church will just shoot out in great ways from this whole COVID season we've been in. And so that's my dream, right? My dream is that people will continue to pour through the doors of this church and other churches because they've come to realize that Jesus followers are legit. They know who they are. They know whose they are. And they're living their life differently because of it. And so that's the dream, right? But I need your help. I can't live that dream out alone. So go wrestle some of this stuff. Think about it. Pray about it. Read your scripture in the middle of this. Write me some emails and challenge me if you want to do that, whatever you'd like, but wrestle with this stuff. Now, I can't go through all 3 weeks of where we've been, but last week, I'll tell you what we did. We kind of got to the conclusion that faith in God overwhelms fear, right? That God has called us not to just menial faith, but faith in him that overwhelms our fear. We just got done singing about that. And I don't know about you, but I was just attached to that song. I found myself screaming it in a horrible key over here. So to everybody behind me, I'm sorry. But that just means something to me that we can believe, right? That there's a way in which we can believe, and when we believe in such a way that our faith would actually overwhelm our fear. That the things that make us afraid wouldn't make us afraid anymore because we know our God is bigger. And that kind of overwhelming faith, that overwhelming faith that overwhelms fear, it honors God. There's something God-honoring in the middle of that. And so we said that we as Jesus followers are called to this type of faith. We're supposed to believe this way. And this is the end game that Jesus is leading us all towards. It's not, heaven, even though heaven will be great, and we are promised that. And it's not being a better person, even though being a better person would be great. And I want that for you, and Jesus wants that for you. What he's calling you to, the end game, the result, is a faith in God that will overwhelm the fear that you face. That no matter what comes your way, no matter how difficult life might be, God's bigger. And that's kind of the end game. That's the win in this whole thing of faith. So today I want to answer another question. We're going to wrestle with something else today. And honestly, when I was thinking about this, yeah, go ahead and laugh. It's okay. What should Jesus followers wear, right? And when I started wrestling with this and talking to my wife, she's like, no one wants your fashion sense, okay? And you're probably right. But what does a Jesus follower wear? Is there a Jesus t-shirt out there we're supposed to be wearing? I'm going to answer this question for you, and I know you're going to be so grateful that I gave you this today. But what is it that Jesus followers wear? Because we know movements have clothes, and, we're going on this journey with Jesus, so what are we supposed to clothe ourselves with? And we get this kind of question on us. I want you to think about this. Check out this picture really fast. What movement are they following? Does anybody know? Yeah, the Atlanta Falcons, right? This is an Atlanta Falcons fan. You look at that, you got that figured out. That's pretty easy, right? And so we think this way a lot about Christianity too. We're in a movement and people need to know, is there a t-shirt, right? Is there a certain outfit and people are going to know that that's who we are? What about this one? Who are they cheering for? Woo-woo, right? Yeah, that's okay. You'll be happy to know there's not a single blue picture in my slides today. For those of you that know me, you know why. And there's not an orange one in there either, just for the record, for anybody to watch the SEC tournament yesterday, but I digress. But seriously, right? They're Bama fans. It's obvious by what they're wearing that they're Bama fans. right? So what makes it obvious that we're Jesus followers? What makes it clear, like, oh, they're with him, right? Is there a t-shirt? Are we supposed to paint like crosses on us or something? Are we supposed to stand up and like J-E-S-U-S, woo? Is that what it is? Like, seriously, what is it? And so, the answer to that question might surprise you. And in fact, Jesus actually answered this question. And the cool thing is, Jesus answered it, and then this guy, Paul, we've been talking about a lot, he actually wrestled with it and extrapolated it and made it make a lot of sense to us in the real world. But I want to give you Jesus' answer. And here's what's cool about this. What I'm about to read to you from Jesus, he said this in the upper room. Judas, who was one of his followers, has already left the room to go betray him. So he's gathered all his followers together. They're getting ready to celebrate this holiday called Passover. It was a really big deal for people that were Jewish, and they had to follow these kind of set rituals. And so they got together for the dinner, and Judas, one of his 12, one of his closest followers, has decided to betray him, and he's already run out of the room. So Judas runs out of the room, and the disciples are kind of shaken. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And Jesus looks at his disciples, and he says, "A new command I give you. A new command I give you." There's something that I would like you to know, and this is really important. So a new command I give you. And then he says, "Love one another." To which the disciples go, "Jesus, that's not a new command. This is we found this in our Old Testament, and God's been talking about this a lot, and this is not a new command. We already know all about this." And Jesus goes, "I'm not done. Hold on. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another." And they went, oh. Because, hey, Matthew, you remember when I called you and you were a tax collector and Peter would have rather spat on you than even been in your presence? You remember that? Yeah. And what did I do? You said, "Follow me." Yeah, I did, didn't I? And I loved you, and I said, "Come with me." And hey, Peter, you remember how emotional you are? Yeah, I remember, Jesus. You remember how messy you make life sometimes? You remember how you get stuff wrong and things don't go quite right? Yeah, Jesus, I remember that. Hey, and what did I say to you? You said, "Follow me." Yes, I did, didn't I? And I loved you, right? Yes, you did. Follow me. Hey, Nathaniel, you remember the day you met me and you ran up to your brother, and what did you say again? I can't remember. You said, "Oh yeah, nothing good could come from Nazareth." Is that what you said? Yeah, Jesus, that's what I said. You dissed my whole family and my hometown, and you dissed everybody I've ever grew up in the culture. Yeah, I did, Jesus. And what did I do? You loved me. Yeah, I did. So as I have loved you, so you must love me. A new command I give you: love one another, not just how you think you can love them, but as I have loved you. And they all probably took a deep breath, right? And all of us who are church people, we take a deep breath and we think. Because it sounds beautiful, and it sounds wonderful, and it sounds awesome, but this also sounds hard. It sounds difficult. And so they're sitting in the upper room, and they're trying to sort this whole thing out, and they're like, okay, I'll do my best. And they take their breath, and they think, and then Jesus, just to make sure they understand the importance of this, because he's not done, okay? But just so they get it, he says, "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples," or my followers, the people who are following with me. "They will know you're mine if you love one another as I have loved you." Not, they will know you are one of mine if you paint your chest, or if you wear your t-shirt, or if you go to church, or even if you read your Bible. They will know you are one of mine if you are loving one another as I have loved you. Isn't it interesting that he made the centerpiece of his movement love? Now, here's what's really interesting. So Jesus has just warned them, look, I'm going to go, okay? I'm going to leave, and I'm going to go someplace you can't go just before this whole event happens. And so Jesus gives us 10-minute probably speech to them about loving one another and explaining to each other what it's supposed to look like. And Simon Peter, being Simon Peter, goes, "Hey, Lord, where are you going?" Well, wait, Peter, didn't you hear my speech? Yeah, I did, but hold on. You say you were leaving. Where are you going? And just like that, I'm reminded that we as kind of churchy people, if I can throw it, and every religion is this way. I'm just picking on us because we're in the room. But those of us who become churchy people, this is a question we want an answer to. The whole love each other thing sounds really hard, so I'm going to divert that whole conversation and say, "Hey, Jesus, a minute ago you said you were going to leave. Right? Let's skip that whole thing you just said and tell me where it is that you're going. Does Nathaniel get to go? Because I don't really like him as much as I like you. And if he's going to go, I don't know that I want to go. Do I get to go with you, Jesus? And wait a minute, did you say John got to go? Does John get to go and I don't? And this whole question, this whole wrestling begins. Where are you going? And here's why I find that interesting. And again, I could say this about any religion. I'm picking on us because I'm a Jesus follower, and many of you all sitting in this room are Jesus followers too. You're Christians, you're people who would say that you're a part of the church. And so I'm picking on us because we're in the room and it seems fair. But one of the things we do as church people is that when we find something that seems difficult, we default to something else that seems easier. And so since loving people who are really hard to love is hard, we kind of default to other things. I can track my behavior, and I can track my, how much I read my scripture, and I can track my attendance in class, and I can track my attendance when I come to church. And I'm not saying any of that stuff is bad. I'm just saying we start to put that ahead of loving others. And I think that's why Jesus put love one another as I have loved you at the centerpiece of his movement, because he knew they would get the behavior stuff right, and he knew that they would figure out how to have discipline and how to obey. He knew they would get all that right, but at the center of it, the gravitational pull of religion is toward rule keeping rather than relationship building. The gravitational pull of religion is towards rule keeping rather than relationship building. And I'm not saying rule keeping's bad, okay? Don't leave out of here. And the only thing Pastor Drew said was don't obey the rules. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it's easier to keep rules than it is to build relationships. And sometimes, the church defaults to this over this. And Jesus said, I know you're going to get this right. I don't want you to miss this. Right? I mean, that's why he said, relationships are messy and relationships are hard. So I want you to start. The centerpiece of how they're going to know who you are is how you love one another. How do you love each other? How do you love people who are difficult to love? How do you love in the midst of difficult circumstances and different socioeconomic backgrounds and different lifestyles and all the stuff? How do you love in the midst of that? Because, again, we're going to kind of oftentimes default to rule keeping. Here's what happens. This is why I think Jesus did this. Here's what happens. When we default to rule keeping over relationship building, we become Pharisees. We become people who are more concerned with being right than we are being loving. I'll never forget, I'm not telling this story to guilt anybody, okay, so don't hear it that way, but I was in seminary. If you didn't know I went to seminary, I did. Maybe that was a problem you want to leave. But I kind of grew up Methodist-Pentecostal. I told you guys that. I was in the midst of a lot of different places. But I chose a Wesleyan seminary to attend. And I was there. And in the midst of my time there was actually another group of people who came and protested on our campus. And they were Christians. And they had signs. They were protesting saying, God hates you. Because, that's what makes me want to run after your religion, a big sign that says God hates you. But it was crazy to me that we had such theological differences that they thought the best thing they could do is tell me how much God hated me for choosing this camp over this camp. That's what happens in the church, okay? And that's a pretty extreme case, but it also looks like, I would really love to love you, but my religion won't let me love you the way that I'm supposed to, so I'm sorry, we can't relate, we can't talk. You believe differently than I do, so I'm going to stay over here and you stay over there. That's what it looks like day to day. You may not be holding up a sign that says God hates you, but in your behavior and in your action and in my behavior and my action, that's what we say to the world. And Jesus knew that. Jesus knew. He looked around at the Pharisees who were God's chosen people. They were people who God loved so much. They were so intelligent. And they knew their scripture backwards and frontwards. But they had defaulted to rule keeping rather than relationship building, and he knew that would be the gravitational pull in his movement. And he said, I want people to know who you are because of the way you love. Now, this is not an excuse to not obey, right? See, how do we sort out this tension between discipline and discipleship? Discipleship just means the idea of how we follow Jesus. How do we sort this tension out? Well, it's not by abandoning one over the other. It's not by abandoning. It's about holding them both in tension. How do we love people as we follow Jesus? How do we call them to follow Jesus, even when we don't feel like they act the way we act or look the way we look or talk the way we talk or whatever else? When there's differences, we default to love every single time. That's what Jesus said to do. And that's a hard teaching. And when I hear it, I find it difficult to think about how I wrestle with this. How do I wrestle this down to the ground myself? So I'm not asking anything of you. Jesus is asking it, so you can tell him no. You don't have to tell me. I'm just reading his words out loud, okay? But when Jesus asks this of us, how do we live into this? Well, that's really what we got to wrestle with. And I think, if I might say, that the Apostle Paul, who we've talked about a lot, was someone who seemed to really, really understand this to be something that was important. And in fact, if you read any of the letters that are left over from the Apostle Paul, what you come to realize is that he held these things in tension, and he had this thing pretty figured out. And he doesn't actually come back out and repeat the words, love others as I have loved you. But if you read through Romans, you read through Galatians, you read through Colossians, which I'm going to read you something from that in just a second, you start to realize Paul understood that the centerpiece of this movement of following Jesus, of walking this way, was loving one another as Jesus had loved them. And so Paul writes a letter. And we have it recorded today. It's actually an amazing thing that we have this letter still. 22 years after the resurrection. Not 120, right? And it wasn't one of those things where it wasn't, maybe you had an English professor in college tell you it was 300 years after or 120 years after. It wasn't. It was 22 years after. 22 years after the resurrection, Paul is writing a letter to the church in Colossae, and it's written to the Colossians. It's in this little town that's about 100 miles north of Ephesus, and there's nothing there now, but in Jesus' day, Colossae was a really big deal. It was a town that was kind of like a centerpiece of trade. And Paul had just planted the church there, all right? It was a town that he would walk into these towns, he would preach in the synagogues, and they would throw him out. But at night, like 9 or 10 people would come up to Paul and go, you know what, this sounds really interesting. Tell me more about this Jesus guy. And then Paul would end up getting them together and training them and speaking to them and then planting a church. And Paul was the greatest church planter in history. He would go all over the Aegean Sea planting churches, all over the Mediterranean Rim planting churches by doing that. He'd just walk into the synagogue and say, you need to know Jesus, he's awesome. And then most of them would throw him out, but 9 or 10 people would start and say, tell me more, and then he would grow this movement from there. And so when he writes this letter to the Colossians, what he's heard is that the people in Colossae are fighting this very thing, this whole tension between discipline and discipleship. How do I tell people to do what they're supposed to do, but also love them the way Jesus said to love? And how do I sort this all out? Paul writes a letter that we still have today that speaks to that, and I find it amazing. And in it, he says our magic words today. So here's how it begins in chapter 3. Therefore, as God's chosen people, he just means Jesus followers, people who are following Jesus. He doesn't mean like there's an elect or anything, just this God's chosen people. Holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with. That's where he starts. Clothe yourselves with. And then he starts to lay out what we're supposed to put on. And surprise, surprise, you may be nervous because Paul lived in a day when there were no zippers and there were no buttons. And so you think if Paul's going to give me fashion advice, I'm not going to like it very much. So that's not what he says. What he begins with is this list, and he starts by saying compassion. Clothe yourselves with compassion. Compassion, actually, in the Greek text is 2 words, not one. It literally means, like, you ever heard someone say, love them from the bottom of your heart? You ever heard that phrase before? Well, what this literally means is love them from the bottom of your bowels, which I find kind of weird, and I think compassion is probably a better word. But love them from the bottom of your bowels. Hey, kids, go to your mom today and say, Mom, I love you from the bottom of my bowels, and see how that goes, okay? Just tell me. I would love to hear those stories. But compassion really just means that what you're doing is you're looking at someone and you're loving them. You're experiencing where they're at. So many times in the way that we relate to each other, it's hard for us because we think like, oh man, well, if they had done better, they wouldn't have made that mistake. If they had listened to me, they wouldn't be in this mess that they're in right now. And maybe you've never said that, and don't raise your hand, but many of us have thought that. We look at someone's circumstances and we think, man, I told you not to do that, and here you are. Compassion literally just means looking at them and time after time after time, no matter what they've done, no matter where they've been, loving them. That's what compassion means. That's what the actual Greek text says there. Then he's not done. He continues. He said kindness. Clothe yourselves with kindness. Kindness is just loaning your strength to someone else. Do you know that? Kindness is saying, I know in this moment, like, I'm gonna give you my strength. I'm gonna lean in with you, and I'm gonna help you through this. That's what kindness is. And I think it's a beautiful action. It's a beautiful action for Jesus followers to say, I know where you're at in this time, and I'm gonna loan you my strength. I'm gonna be with you and walk beside you in the midst of this. And he continues, he says, clothe yourselves with humility. Humility is simply just seeing yourself and seeing your life through the grander picture of the way God sees you and sees your life. This is a big deal to me. It's a really big deal to me because I struggle with the opposite of this so many times. One of the things that I've struggled with so much as a kid is the opposite of this, that look at me, look how awesome I am. Because I'm the first kid in the family, I was the first grandson, all the things, and so I often look at my gifts and look at the way God built me, and I'm like, look, aren't you glad I'm here? That's kind of my default reaction sometimes. Humility is the opposite of that. Humility is looking out and going, it's not about your gifts. It's not about what God did in you. It's about the fact that the person you're looking at is loved by God just as much as you are. And is putting yourself in this right view of the world. And so humility is such a big deal because it helps us to realize every single person that we look at is someone that God values, is someone that God made, is someone that God built, and that God has a purpose for that someone. No matter whether you think your gifts are better or worse or whatever else. And humility gives you the idea, it gives you the opportunity to look into their lives and go, it's not about what I am compared to you. It's about the fact that we're both created beings from a God who loves us. And so it just brings a right view of equality in the midst of our conversations. And it helps us stop ranking. I don't know what it is about Americans, because this actually doesn't happen in other parts of the world, places that I've traveled, but we as Americans are particularly susceptible to this, and I went to this college, and you went to this college, or I live in this neighborhood, and you live in this neighborhood. It's this whole comparison trap thing, and I don't know why we do that, okay? I'm not saying it doesn't exist anywhere, but it is a particularly American thing for us to rank one another. Paul says, no, none of that. Clothe yourselves with humility. Realize that you're all in this grand kingdom that God has created, and all of you are equal in the midst of that. And some of you have different gifts than one another, but everybody's loved the same way by God. And he's not done. He continues, he says, gentleness. Clothe yourselves with gentleness. Gentleness is looking at someone and taking where they are, their strengths, their weaknesses, their place, and working off of their strengths, not yours. And what I mean is, this is going into a situation where you not worried about how much power you have over them. It's laying your power down to come at them where they are, to approach them in exactly the kind of same pace and the same walk of life that they are. You've met people that are this way, that, here's what I mean by this. It's the difference. We have the capacity as human beings to pick up a contact lens carefully off the end of our finger and also to pick up a baseball with our whole hand. The gentleness is choosing to act in life and treat people with the same delicateness and gentleness in which we take the contact lens off of our finger rather than the crushing hand of the baseball in the other. Does that make sense? It's this idea that we would actually look and relate to people as gentle as possible. Not to lord our power over them, not to bulldoze them, not to wrecking ball them, but to actually approach them with gentleness. And then everyone's favorite, he closes out with this one, and patience. And patience. How I've come to understand this term and how I've come to understand what this looks like is that as a parent, and maybe not everybody can relate to this, but this one's particularly potent for me. When I take my kids to the zoo, I set the direction of where we want to go, but my 5-year-old sets the pace. You know what I mean? Like, if I took my 5-year-old at the same pace through the zoo that I would want to go, I would be dragging her and she'd have scuffs on her shoes and it would just be a really bad day, right? And sometimes when I'm walking through the zoo with my 5-year-old, she sits down on the curb and says, I'm not moving till I get ice cream. And I could drag her off the curb, but that wouldn't make me a very good dad. Patience is approaching people where you might be leading them, but you're setting the direction and they're setting the pace. You are slowing yourself down to where they are. And Paul says, this is how Jesus followers act. That this is a defining virtue of being a Jesus follower, that you would be patient. That as your friends sit down on the curb in desperate need of ice cream, you wouldn't drag them off. Right? That's kind of the way that looks. And then he kind of summarizes it up and he says, look, bear with each other, right? So you understand where this whole thing comes from. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, and hey, here comes a term that's going to sound familiar to you, forgive as the Lord forgave you. Oh, right? Again, it's that whole same thing. If we can think about the things that, and Jesus followers, if I can speak just to you for just a minute. If you're not a Jesus follower and you're in the room, this is kind of the life you're called to, so you get like a window and a picture in, but this isn't something that like I'm going to force over you right now, and Jesus isn't forcing this over you either. But for those of you that are Jesus followers, think for a moment of all of the things that you have been forgiven for. Think for all of the ways in which God might have had, right, if it had been us. And think about how you might relate to you on the outside of your situation for the things you've been forgiven for. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. It's a really beautiful kind of call to realize our actual place in this grander vision of this picture of what God's doing in the world. And then as the kind of like, Paul uses a phrase, and the English translation of this is a little rough, so I'm going to walk through it with you, but he uses a phrase that shows where all this comes from. So all these virtues are awesome, and they're fantastic, and we should live into all of them, but there's an overarching thing that holds them all together. And this is what he says. Over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. Unity is not actually in the Greek text. The Greek text actually says the thing that holds them together perfectly is love. That all these virtues are awesome, but the thing that will hold them together, the thing that will make them work in your life is love. It's love. Love is always the center. Paul got that. And like, here's the thing. If you're not a Jesus follower, you will really love Paul because he could not stand Jesus followers. And maybe you've met some you don't like either. Maybe he threw him in prison. He wanted to stamp out the whole movement. And maybe you've met a Jesus follower or two you'd like to throw in prison. I don't know. Hopefully they're not in this room, right? But Paul was a guy who not only experienced that all outside of the thing, and like looking at Jesus followers is a terrible mistake, then he met some. Then he met Jesus. And then he became one. And then not only did he become one, he became the greatest church planter in history. He was a guy who stood completely opposed to everything that Jesus said until he spoke to him himself. And then because he experienced all these other things, he became one. And we know his name today because of that moment. That's the only reason we know who he is. So here's the list, okay? This is the follow where, right? If you're going to pack your suitcase and follow Jesus and walk on the way, here is the list. And this feels like really religious to me. And maybe like you came in and you're like, oh, it's so nice. And then I whisper them this, it's like compassion. It just sounds so churchy, doesn't it? And humility. And it's so awesome. But here's what I know. Maybe if you're a church person, a Jesus follower, you've heard this list before. You've probably read this list before. And what could happen, okay, what could happen today is you go to lunch, and I'm going to give myself a little bit of credit, and maybe you don't say this words, and I'm not telling you, but you go to lunch today, it's like, oh, man, Drew was really on it today. Wasn't that just such a great message? And then you go, oh, man, it wasn't just so awesome. I felt so like empowered today. And then when lunch is over, you move on with your life, and you're like, what's coming next week, right? That's probably what happened to you because it happened to me. I grew up in the church. I've been around the church my entire life. I didn't put these into practice the first time I heard it. I can guarantee you, and I don't want to like point fingers, but I kind of guess you probably didn't either. So what do we do? Well, I came up with a way, and this is lame. I want you all to say out loud, this is lame. Say it with me. This is lame. This is lame, okay? This is the lamest thing I have ever said. In fact, when I wrote it and gave it to the staff, I said, I cannot believe I'm doing this on Sunday. But I came up with a way for you to remember this and to put it into practice, and it is so lame. Have any of y'all ever seen a PG chick flick before? Okay, here we go. Here's the new list. Chick flick PG. You're like, this is what we pay him for. Yes. Chick flick PG. Okay, this is an easy way to remember this, okay? Because seriously, what I don't want you to do is go home and go, man, that was really awesome. What was that list again? Because you're not always going to have your phone with the picture of the slide you just took a minute ago, and you're not even going to you might tweet this and then forget about it, and it'll be a year, and you go, oh man, look at that Facebook memory. I should have done that. I don't want that. I want you to wake up tomorrow. I want you to get in your car before you go to work, and I want you to sit down and I want you to pray, and I want you to think about this. And if you just remember, chick flick PG, you'll get them in order. And I put kindness in twice because a lot of us could use that, okay? And it makes it work. Now, look, if you don't like my motto, make your own, okay? Email me back and say, I came up with a way better way. I added vowels. It's awesome, and I remember. Fantastic. Knock yourself out. The point is, I want you to remember this. I want you to wake up in the morning and go like, dear Lord, I want to experience chick flick today. Like, I want compassion. Lord, will you help me when I look at my coworkers that drive me insane to be compassionate with where they are? God, would you just help me today to realize in the grander scheme of where I am that humility is a characteristic of virtue you've called me to. That, Lord, when I look at my people that are around me, and no matter where I find myself, no matter where I think about them, they are loved by you, and I am loved by you, and we are equal in that. Lord, today, would you let me be kind to the people that are around me? God, would you just give me the strength and the courage and the boldness that I need to be kind to the people that are in my life today, the ones that are going to cross my path? Because I am representing you today, and someone somewhere who's not following you is going to see me. Let me be kind to them today. God, let me forgive, right? Let me forgive because you have forgiven me. And let me not only forgive, let me forgive in the way that you have forgiven me. God, would you let me be loving today? Would you let me be loving today? Would you just give me this opportunity to love in the way that maybe I've never loved before? That I would love not just as I choose to love, but as you have chosen to love me? Would you let me love that way? God, would you give me kindness again, because I'm asking for it twice, and it makes Pastor Drew's model work, and I could really, really use it, and I really want to be kind to the people that are around me. God, would you give me patience today? Would you just help me to move at the pace of the people that are around me today? Not my pace, not the pace that I would set for my employees, not the pace that I would set for my coworkers, but their pace, so that I can lead them to walk this way with you. God, would you let me be gentle today? Would you just help me? Help me to be able to move with the power and the strength that is where the people are who I'm going to relate to. Not my strength, not my power. Let me move in the midst of their pace and their power and their strength. God, in Jesus' name, amen. Like, there could be no more greater blessing to me if you all woke up in the morning and decided to do that, right? And you went, I'm going to do Chick Flick PG today, right? That's going to be the way I'm going to live my life. Or I'm going to write a new model because Pastor Drew's is way too lame. Cool, awesome, knock yourself out, okay? But this is what's really important about this. Here's why I think Jesus said this and stressed this so much. This is not natural. What you're doing is natural, right? I mean, this is not natural behavior. What you're doing is natural. And so when Jesus said, a new command I give you, and they went, love one another, well, that's not a new command, that's an old one. No. I want you to understand how new this actually is. Love one another as I have loved you. And Paul looks at this and he goes, again, therefore, as God's chosen people, clothe yourselves. Clothe yourselves. Make a conscious decision to move in a new direction. Make a conscious decision to do different things. See, I'm convinced, and some of you all need to hear this. I need to hear this. What we're doing is the default setting stuff. Right, what we're doing, the way we act, and the church doesn't function at its best capacity when we're just doing default stuff. The church, like, can you imagine what our community would look like? Can you imagine what would happen in the world if everyone who said, I'm going to walk this way with Jesus, and everyone who said, I'm going to be a Jesus follower, if we decided to wake up every day and love others as Jesus has loved us? Can you imagine? Can you imagine what the world would look like? And I think when we get this wrong is when we decide we need picket signs. And I think when we get this wrong is when we start casting people out. I think when we get this wrong is when the church starts getting divided over things that are complicated, yes, but we stop talking. I think when we get this wrong is when stuff starts falling apart. And if we're really going to walk this way, like if we really feel like we've been called to follow Jesus, to walk in this direction He's called us to, this is what we have to get right first. Can you imagine what your life would look like? Because here's what I know. Okay, you are sitting with people who have experienced life change, right? And the thing about Jesus that's so beautiful is Jesus didn't come just to make a point. Like, it's easy to make a point. It's easy for me to make a point. I can stand up I can make a Facebook post or a tweet or whatever else, and in 10 seconds I can blurt out my grenade of whatever it might be, but I just made a point. What Jesus wanted to do was make a difference. He wanted a movement. And I think the church functions best as a movement who's making a difference when we get this right. When these virtues are what we put on, when we live into this whole idea that we've been called to love. And I would love in my lifetime to hand the church off to my children as a group of people who got this right. When it's time for me to take the mantle off and lay it on the shoulders of my children and for them to lay it on my grandchildren's shoulders, I would love to hand them a church that has more influence in the community, more change has happened in the community than ever before because we got this right. This is what we've been asked to pack in our suitcase. And I invite you to do this with me, to do this, to follow Jesus. We're all walking this way together. And it's not natural. It's not natural. But you get to make the conscious choice to do it. Let me pray for you. Father God, I just want to thank you so much for Paul and for the gift of your son, Jesus. And that Jesus taught us these things, that he knew that the gravitational pull for all of us as his followers was going to be to try to follow the rules and to do the right things. And I'm not saying don't follow the rules, and I'm not saying don't do the right things, which you weren't either. You just knew that the thing we were most tempted to get wrong will be how we love each other. The thing we'd be most tempted to get wrong was how we relate to one another. So God, as my brothers and sisters, as people in this room this morning, every man, every woman, every student, every child, everyone in between who's in this room today, God, would you just give them the boldness and the courage and the strength that they need to be able to live into these virtues, this chick flick PG, that they would do this tomorrow, that they would start patterning their life in a new way. God, we ask you all of these things. We praise you in the name of Jesus. We ask all those things in his name. Amen. Thank you all so much for coming to TCAT today. God bless you. Thanks for listening to part 4. We got part 5 starting next week, so I'll see you next Sunday. God bless.